Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of In the Pit with Lobo Tigre. Our victim of the day, or our guest, is Sergei Stefanovich. He's the managing director of Orsu Metals, a very interesting company working in a very interesting part of the world. But Sergei, why don't you go ahead and give us the quick overview, and then I'll get into my questions.
Yeah, Lobo, thank you for inviting. It's a privilege to be here and talking to yourself and to your audience. Yes, I'm Sergei Stefanovich, Managing Director of a company called Orsu Metals Corporation. Orsu Metals Corporation is a company listed on TSXV, and in fact it has been in existence for a number of years, but I guess, about 2 years ago it kind of started a new stage of its life by acquiring for stock a gold property in Russia, and that's what Orsu has been solely doing over the past 2 years. Since I was one of the vendors of this gold property, I became a significant shareholder, in fact the largest shareholder of Orsu, and I also was offered a challenge and responsibility, but also an opportunity to run this company as the managing director, and for this I'm very grateful to the executive chairman, Sergei Kurzin. So the company is not where we want to be in terms of size. It's a 10 million Canadian company. We've done the exploration over the past 2 years, as I said. We are working very, very fast in terms of pace. I run the company very, very frugally. Our G&A is low. Essentially, all the money goes into the project. So far, we've extended about $4 million over the past 20 months into exploration. We did about 17.5 kilometers of diamond drilling. We did about 5,000 meters of trenching, all the analytics, geophysics, and what we have to show for this was announced 2 weeks ago. We announced a pit optimized, so it's not a global resource. Global resource is 1.43 million ounces, but within the pit, optimized pit, we have a very good start of 1.2 million ounces at a grade of nearly 1.5 gram of gold per ton. So it's not a bad start for only 20 months of work and 4 million spent. 4 million divided by 1.2 million ounces in the optimized pit works out to be anywhere between something like $3.5 per ounce, right? That's like 50% of what's the benchmark would be for an inferred ounce across the world. That's what I said before. We're working very frugally. We spend the money specifically on exploration. We are not in business of raising cash from the shareholders and recycling this into salaries in the pockets of the management. That's not the business we're not in this business. I think that the company has a very crisp strategy. We have a very good start of 1.2 million ounces. We have an ambition, a geological potential, and I believe funding to grow this resource significantly. But I guess, for a brief introduction, that would probably suffice what I said just now.
Sure. Well, I want to get into discussing your deposit there, because that's what really brought this to my attention. That's a significant first pass resource, and we'll get into that. But listening to you now, I have to ask, Sergei Kurzin is a famous explorer. Why would he turn the reins over to you, a relatively unknown person from living in Switzerland, to push the project forward?
Well, first of all, I know that you met Sergei, and Sergei is a strong individual and a strong personality. And when he says, I'm acting chairman, or not acting chairman, I'm executive chairman, right? That still means, that he's heavily involved, and he likes, to kick my ass around, from time to time, and see where we're getting with the exploration. So Sergei is still involved, but I guess, he feels like, there are younger guys who have more energy and go-getters, and they still have to get things that he's gotten already in his past. So I wouldn't say, that Sergei kind of I'd say, he stepped back a bit, but he's very actively involved. He provides support, he provides vision, he runs the board, he's the executive chairman. I speak to Sergei at least once in 2 days. So I'd say, that, he wants to give younger guys a chance to prove themselves, and he wants to see if their energy would carry the company to where he believes, what we are doing, merits us to get. I think, that we can get much bigger and much further compared to where we are today. And I think, I'm very grateful to Sergei, and it's my privilege working with him. And I'm grateful to him for giving me a chance to run this company, which I believe, I'm fully capable of doing.
Fair enough. Okay, so I have to ask, is it just a coincidence that the deposit is called Sergeyevskoye? Or is that named after one of you Sergeys? Or how did that happen?
It gets worse than this. It gets worse than this. The company, the Russian subsidiary, which owns the license, and the company belongs to Orsu, is called Alexandrovskaya, right? My son is Alexander. The director of exploration and a famous geologist, Alexander Yakubchuk, his patronymic name is Sergeyevich, right? So his father was Sergei, right? I am Sergei. So it's a bit of, mashed potato, between Sergeys and Alexanders. It's coincident, but to be honest with you, with the age, I'm getting, a bit mystique. I was someone who was born in the Soviet Union. I was a former, very firm materialist, right? I sort of, evolved, right, as a personality, and I believe, in some mystic things being good for us, and some actual mystic things being bad for us. So actually, I see nothing wrong with this. I think, it all comes nicely. If you have to err on a side, I'd like to err on the side of hope. I believe, it's a good sign.
Very good. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the deposit. 1.5 grams is very good for an open pit. What kind of deposit are we looking at? Are we looking at some sort of disseminated bulk tonnage, or are these stacked veins that happen to be an open pit, or what's the geology and what's the potential, of course?
It's an intrusion-related system. It's cascaded sheets. The width, right, of the deposit, if we are looking, from the plan, is about 600 meters. And so far, at the longest point at strike, we reached about 900 meters. So we're talking about a domain of 900 meters by 600 meters. I believe it's a start. We are limited in terms of where we can go east from our license by actually having a deposit next to us, and this makes it very interesting, but we'll get back to this. But the deposit remains fully open to the west. The deposit remains fully open to the northwest. It remains fully open to the down dip, right? So I think, that we are talking about potentially a much larger system.
And sorry, let me jump in and ask there. As I recall from the diagrams in the presentation, the deposit sort of dips to the west, right? There is the issue with your neighbors to the east, but am I right in remembering that it dips to the west? It's open, down dip, and onto your land? Is that right?
It doesn't dip. It doesn't dip. So far, we actually don't see any significant change in terms of how vertically the ore structures would continue to the west or northwest. But I guess, in terms of depth, what I'm saying is that the deposit, and this is a separate subject we need to discuss necessarily, but the deposit that is essentially, we are sharing a license border to the east with this deposit, and this deposit is a huge one. It's about 5.5 million ounces, right? We are sharing a license border, and essentially the western wall of their pit, because it used to be a mine, it's on care and maintenance now, but it used to be a mine. The western wall of their pit is only 300 meters away from where we have mineralization starting, right? So I do believe, that we're talking about the same system, right, which can be combined at some point geologically speaking, right? And talking about the depth, as far as we know, the depth of the deposit, which is next to us, is about 600 meters. We've done the calculation of the maiden resource down to a depth of 200 to 150 meters, approximately, right? So we can quite confidently say that why would we see that our structures would not go as deep as the structures in the deposit, which is only 300 meters away from us, which has been extensively drilled and which has 5.5 million ounces. So I guess the important thing is, there is a potential to go down, there is a potential to go westwards, there is potential to go northwest, there's plenty of potential there. But the other point is that essentially we are talking about discovering a deposit or an extension of the existing ones. So we're not doing, a greenfield exploration at all. What we are doing, and that contributes to the lower cost of discovery, and certainly more geological certainty, what we are doing essentially a brownfield expansion of something that has been in existence for about 100 years.
Right. Okay. So, why is that other mine on care and maintenance?
Well, that's interesting because we don't really know. We feel that the owners who had the mine over the past 15 years or so, they were not actually miners. They were essentially banking, on the valuations, on the exploration upside. Fair enough, they've done a lot of work. They extended the deposit. They did about whatever, 40 to 50,000 meters of additional drilling, right? So they increased the deposit. They kind of rewrapped it, there is better understanding of that. But to me, it seems like, they never really had an ambition to actually become mine builders, right? It was more about, doing what we are doing, sort of a junior exploration job. The deposit was put back on care and maintenance in 2002, when the gold prices were under $300 an ounce. So this type of deposit, sort of, low grade, large scale, really require a strong operator. I mean, when we are talking about 5 million tons of ore plus, right? Low grade, sort of relatively low grade. I'm not talking about us, I'm talking about, our neighbors, right? That really requires a strong operator and really requires size, and size means capex, right? What's interesting and intriguing is that as far as we understand from reports in the media, the second largest gold producer in China, China National Gold, will close the acquisition of this property next to us within next couple of weeks, right? China National Gold is exactly the type of operator that you would want for this kind of deposit, right? Chinese are great about, very smartly employing capital. They can really build fairly cheaply. They're great at operating at a fairly cheap price, and that's all it takes about large-scale, low-grade deposits. It's about rubber, it's about fuel, it's about salaries, it's about efficiency, right?
Well, that's very interesting. Yeah. Sorry, let me ask. Are we to understand from what you're saying that what you've discovered just off the west side of their pit is higher grade than what they have?
Yes. Yes, we notice high grades. We have an ambition to actually bootstrap our grades to something like 1.7, 1.8, and I'll explain how. The other thing is, what kind of cutoff they would apply and we would apply. We apply 0.5 and we get 1.5, right? Average grade, right? Since the owners of the mine next to us, they're not a public company, we actually do not have a very reliable data in terms of what cutoff they're using. But as far as I understand, we are talking about a large deposit of something like 150 million tons containing anywhere between 5 to 6 million ounces of gold. Unfortunately, they're not a public company, and therefore, even if we were to know, we wouldn't be able to disclose. But to be honest with you, we don't actually know all the economic parameters.
Right. No, but it's very interesting though, because if China National Gold does make this acquisition, and it's reasonable to think that what you've got, right off the property line is higher grade than what they've got, that naturally would make you an acquisition target. And I'm not going to try to trick you into any forward-looking statements there, but it makes it very interesting because, it's obvious that anybody serious about putting the mine next door back into production would have to look at you.
Well, I think, the China National Gold being there proves that A, we have a right geological address, right? Number two, it does add spice to the story. Because if you were to combine, and do simple math and combine, 5 million, 5.5 million ounces they have, we announced 1.2, and we are not going to stop there, as I said, just to start. We do have an ambition, of at least doubling the resource and maybe going better than this. Geology provides the opportunity to achieve this. Plus, on top of this, we throw in 1.5 million ounces that have already been mined out of this mine, which is next to us, right? We are talking about something like a sub 10 million ounce system, and that's world class by definition, by any definition. 10 million ounces is world class, right? The other thing is that, look, it does perfect industrial logic to actually combine the two operations. or to go smartly about this operation, sort of similarly how Barrick and Newmont go about their operations in Nevada, right? I mean, they really have to be make sure that you do not sort of quarrel to suboptimize the economics of either project, right? So it really takes, common sense approach, and yeah, I mean, it does create, some potential interesting M&A context, and a nice sort of trading backdrop for the shares, I hope.
Right. Okay. Well, let's suppose just, for the sake of the argument that, the deal doesn't happen with China National Gold. These other guys who don't really want to be miners stay there, and now you're a standalone project. With that grade, it still seems like it has a good chance. But with your pit, pushing up against their boundary, you're going to be leaving some gold in the ground because you can't push back your pit into their property. Unless you could make a deal with them just to give you access. Like if they don't want to mine and they're not ready for that, is there a chance that you could make a deal with the current owners just to allow you to push your pit back into their side and to put your thing in operation? And sorry, so the question number one is, can that be done? Possibly. And if it could, do you know how much gold you have down there between, that would not fall inside your pit, but is between you and the deposit next door?
Yes. As I said, look, due to the requirements of 43101 code, right? We can only be talking about the resource as such that is within the pit, right? And within the license, right? Within the license. If we were to sort of assume the license border away and just build a pit around the resource as we know it, our resource, right? We'd be talking about 1.35 million ounces out of 1.35 million ounces within the pit out of 1.43 global resource. So we are only losing 80,000 ounces, right, due to pit optimization. That's actually very good. If it were not for the license, we would have additional 150,000 ounces, right? Now, what's the significance of not being able to mine it unless we make a deal with the neighbors? As I said, look, we see a potential to at least double the resource, right? Going westwards, going northwestwards, and therefore it's not a fatal thing as such, right? Number two, look, it's becoming, too much of a conjecture to the point of being sort of, deprived of any common sense. But certainly no owner would be even discussing the opportunity to relinquish some of the license to us while being on the verge of closing a deal with China National Gold. And I do believe, that if China National Gold were to come in, I think, that for them, sort of, it's a negotiation standpoint and a commanding height, if you wish, that they would not be willing, to give up. So I think, that it's not a good thing, not to be able to mine approximately 150,000 ounces, 150,000 ounces, 1.2, 1.35. But it's actually a price one has to pay for this nice situation of being within sort of an M&A context and having, a neighbor like China National Gold being next to you. I think it kind of pays, for the cost of not being able to mine this 150,000 ounces. And as I said, the potential to grow with the resource is much larger. So 150,000 ounces, wouldn't really make or change our lives to any significant extent.
All right, understood. So whether that goes forward or not, or how it goes forward, let's suppose that takes time. What would you do if basically whatever happens with your neighbors is going to be bought in the future? You don't just sit there and wait, you keep drilling. What are your highest priority targets? Where do you see expanding what you have on your side in the year ahead?
Yeah, well, this is exactly a very right question. And again, I don't want to create a theme that the value in this company is about, betting, is a bet on selling this onto China National Gold.
Well, you wouldn't want to be taken over at this level anyway. You would want to add more value, and I think you'd want to see a much higher share price before something like that happened.
Absolutely. We need time. We need to do more work. But as I said, first of all, it's nice to be next to a big deposit and actually have better grades, right? Because whoever is the owner, it's just a matter of time, given the depletion of reserves across the planet, right? It actually doesn't matter. I mean, it does, but to a certain extent, someone will mine it sooner or later, and someone, where it's China Gold or where it's somebody else, would still be looking at us, and saying, okay, can we do something together? That's point number one. Number two, so we're not betting the house on Chinese or anyone owning this deposit. What we want to do, we want to create a deposit which can stand on its own feet. We do believe that geology would provide a potential to at least double the resource, i.e., ambitiously, I want to get anywhere between 2.5 to 3 million ounces within the next 2 years, right? That's sort of a number in mind where we want to get.
Sorry, Sergei, what's the basis for that? Is there a certain geochemical footprint in which you have the current resource and that footprint is twice as large, or what is the basis for that forward-looking statement?
Well, forward-looking statement. We see that the structures, they keep going to the west and northwest, right? We see them no stopping. Actually, there is an old Soviet hole which is something like 500 meters to the west from where we stopped drilling last year, right? And we are talking about the extent of a strike of 900 meters established today. If we were to add, another 500 meters with the same grades, right? Figure it out, right? We're already talking about, 30% increase, right? Then, as I said, maiden resource was done with a limit of 2 to 250 meters, right? We can certainly double that, and the grades keep growing there. I mean, the deeper we go, the grades keep going, right? So if the grades were to continue to grow, right, or at least to remain at the levels where we saw them at the lower horizons, right, we can safely add quite a bit of material at depth, right? So it's both about extending the deposit in terms of footprint and also going deep, but also there is a potential to increase the grades. And that can become a bit of a technical discussion. We drilled last year with a spacing of 80 meters, right? And therefore, we've lost some of the grade, which we would recover if we were to do infill and drill 40 by 40, right? That would give us, some sort of bootstrapping in terms of grade. The GS is saying, we can be talking about getting this deposit average grade to something like 1.7. I'm not saying, it's a sure thing to do, but I guess, there is a good probability of doing that. So it's about three things, extending the footprint, going deep, and see what we can do with grade, because we have so much more understanding where the grades are, right? Coming back to a bigger picture, yes, we want to get to 2.5, 3 million ounces within 2 exploration seasons, 2019, 2020. We want to do a preliminary feasibility study within the first half of 2021, right? We figure we may need anywhere between $10 to $12 million of capital that's required to achieve these targets. And then we'll have a nice sort of, cut of meat, right? A filet mignon, if you wish, right? And then we need to kind of figure out and have a very interesting question. Who's going to develop it? Are we going to self-develop it? Are we going to sell the project? Are we going to partner with someone? But there'll be a buy because we'll have goods for this. At least, we'll have a nice piece of, and we will just need to find a cook, right? To help us, to help us fry the steak or grill the steak. But that's the idea. So, as I said, we have a very crisp plan, which is not really dependent upon Chinese. It's about creating a significant deposit with good grades within the next couple of years. That will be a very nice property. And yeah, I think, we have a very crisp plan.
Understood. I was going to ask about the budget, but you've already thrown that out there. So I have to then ask, how much cash do you have in the bank now, and what's the plan to fund this work?
This is, what I can't say, keeps me awake at night, but this is something, that the board gave me a mandate a week ago to figure out how we're going to come up with the financing for this year, right? And the larger plan is this. I guess, I would invite anyone to look at the corporate presentation of Orsu. And there is a very interesting slide which kind of depicts where we are and the location. There is a brand new mill, something, a mill that was commissioned about 5 years ago. The mill has a capacity of about 900,000 tons. Of course, we are friendly with our neighbors. It belongs to a Russian miner. It's to the west, not to the east as Chinese, but to the west, right? The mill has about 900,000 tons of annual capacity. And as far as I understand, and I had a meeting with the principal shareholder of this group, this Russian gold mining group, they're saying they're willing, to see and to use their mill as sort of a hub, processing hub, for processing the ores and the material, not just from their own open pit, but they're very happy and they would be willing, and actually, they're kind of elbowing us towards making a decision as soon as possible if we should be able to start selling them ores as soon as Q4 this year or Q1 next year, right? And I don't really want to throw in numbers, but if this were to operate, and we're going to see this after we do the bulk test in September, October this year, but if the bulk test demonstrates that the recoveries are good, I think, that the funding problems of the company or the funding issues of the company will be resolved as soon as of spring next year, meaning that the cash generated from sale of material to the plant next to us, it's 5 kilometers away, line of sight, it's very close, right? So it's not an issue to truck it, right? Moreover, the guys are very happy, to come, blast, excavate, right? Truck our stuff. So actually we have zero capital expenditure. We have zero operating expense. If in effect, we just get a royalty of a certain number of dollars for each ton of ore we sell. But that's a bigger plan. That's not certain, but it's very, very likely and very probable, and we're working towards this. So I guess, the funding problems of this company for 2020, 2021 will be resolved, by this sort of temporary plug, cash generating plug. The real issue is 2019. We have 1.5 million US dollars in cash left in the bank. We can probably do some scout drilling. I'm talking about 3,000 to 4,000 meters this year, right? To actually prove the potential, the geological potential of the system. Drill a few holes here, drill a few holes there, right? Demonstrate the intervals, demonstrate the continuity of the system, right? And then raise capital or wait until this cash that I'm talking about, internally generated cash, starts coming in, right? I would call this a mini program, right? The Maxi program. Look, we're an exploration company. I do believe, that we need to keep the pace and we need to keep exploring, right? Therefore, I do want to and contemplate a more ambitious plan of raising anywhere, something like $1.5 million, give or take, right? In June this year, provided the market conditions permit. And in June, July, embarking on a far more serious sort of 11 to 12,000 meters exploration program with the aim towards getting an upgraded resource by the end of this year, maybe Q1 next year, right? That's a more ambitious thing. I had board's mandate, to raise this capital. We're having a number of discussions. I guess, it'll be premature to be
sure
to be talking about it right now. But basically,
go ahead. Yeah, that's a very interesting option, though, with the other neighbors that you have. I thought you might say, well, maybe we'll do a streaming deal or sell a royalty or something. But I think, selling a few tons off the top is much less of an encumbrance on the asset going forward than a royalty or a streaming deal. So if you have that option, that makes it quite interesting.
It is very interesting. It is very interesting. And I guess, one has to mind in head one thing, right? That we are all big shareholders. I'm a 20% shareholder in this company, right? As I said, we are not a lifestyle company. We are not in business of raising cash and paying salaries. Salaries are really low. Our entire G&A is about $500,000 US, right? That includes salaries, exchange costs, anything, right? So we take the issue of dilution very, very carefully, right? And therefore, we are looking, for a temporary plug this year to keep the pace, and we are consciously prepared to take reasonable dilution, but very reasonable, right? To get us through towards having this deal, which I spoke about, right, that would generate cash for us, as soon as Q1 next year and see some cash coming in Q1 next year, and then bingo. We could embark, on a very small, limited exploration program, 3,000 meters this year, and just wait for the next year. I just don't believe, that this is a very sound strategy. As I said, we are explorer, we have so much potential, we should just keep drilling.
Well, I can certainly understand that. Since you've brought up the share structure, let's go ahead and I looked at that, and I've been aware of Orsu for some time, from the other Sergei's time at the helm, and I can't remember how many years ago I first heard about this company. So I was very surprised to see that you only have 36 plus million shares issued and outstanding. Was there a rollback at some point? Do you know?
Was there? Yes. That's one of the first things we did, because just optically it doesn't look good, when your shares traded 2 cents a share, 3 cents a share, and it makes life excited, because if the share price goes by 1 cent, you can see suddenly 50% increase in the share price, right? Yeah, it's my dry sense of humor telling this, right? But to be honest, we wanted to do a rollback, and we did immediately this, I guess, in June 2017. So we swapped 10 shares for 1, and that's where we are today. So the number of shares is really
okay. That makes sense.
We have fewer shares now, and trust me, I tried to make possible, to get this company to where I believe, it's going to, at a minimum increase of shares in terms of
Understood. I also noticed that it says that you have 35.4% board and insider ownership of the company. So, people evidently have a vested interest here along with shareholders. But I wonder how much of that is actual cash put into this deal versus options that were given to the directors and so on. How much cash skin in the game is your 20%?
That's interesting, because as I said, the Orsu acquired this property for essentially a stock deal back in 2017, right? So the real issue is how much cash was spent prior to Orsu acquisition by the guys who owned this property before, and I was one of them, right? And I guess our historic cost on that. Look, let's put it simply. I don't really have permission, to talk about others people's money business, right? But my personal cost into this project is about $1 million and 6 years of life, right? And these 6 years, I was not getting what I was getting as the head of strategy and M&A in Nipple, for example, right? So essentially, there is a big opportunity cost of capital and cost of a big opportunity cost of sort of life involved into this, right? So the answer is very simple: $1 million US, me personally, right? Plus 6 years of life.
Very good. Okay, I understand, and that's a fair answer, and that constitutes skin in the game for me. The other question I have about the shares is, you look at the chart and it's kind of scary. It seems to trade almost by appointment. So to do the things that you've got to do, you've got to get some more liquidity going there. And maybe that does make sense for doing a raise with one of the brokerages that can bring more retail to the story. Or is there a plan there to increase the liquidity? If I was to decide as a result of this conversation that I want to buy your stock, I'd look at the chart, and that would scare me. I would think, oh, well, what if I need to sell and nobody's buying?
Look, again, I'm sort of running a bit ahead of time. But first of all, yes, I do understand this is a problem, right? That's an issue, right? And to a certain extent, it's a flip side of the fact that the management insiders are so much aligned with the success of this business, right? That actually there is no much free float. We're only talking about anywhere between 40 to 45% shares available to be traded at the exchange, and that's probably not enough. That's one thing, So actually we need to think how to increase the free float, and we are thinking about this. Number two, look, we are only starting to take this equity story of the company into the market, right? To be honest with you, the first conference I attended and the first bunch of investors I met was November last year. So we've been only 6 months on the road, right? And therefore, I do believe, that an incredible amount of time in terms of shoe and leg work, right, that I'm committing to this, would sooner or later translate into increased trading volumes. We hired a market maker in Canada. Let's see whether it's going to help. I think, long term it's going to help. But I guess, we just need to keep what we are doing, keep doing good things and keep telling people about these good things. That would attract attention. And sometimes, just a matter of patience. But also I have a plan. To be honest. So, let's put aside the propaganda. I have a plan. I just think, that we have some legacy shareholders, right? Who were with me from early days. They are not involved in the company in terms of executive roles anymore, right? And the guys may be willing, to come out of their positions. And they have, in total, between two of them, they may have about 10% of the stock, right? So what I'm thinking about is thinking if at some point, say fall this year, right, we would find a nice and clean way to ease these shares into the market without sinking the stock price, right? Or necessarily, basically, I don't want to disrupt the market, right? Obviously, I don't want to do it before the capital raise. And obviously, you would say, Sergei, you're saying something silly, you may have a big overhang. First of all, it's a controllable overhang, right? They don't have to sell, but they may sell if I ask them to, right? And the share price makes sense. And number two, it does require a fair evaluation, right? What's on the balance of things? Whether it's a good decision to actually have another 10% of the shares, and mind, these are not new shares, these are old shares, right? Secondary shares. To be out in the market and take short-term reduction in share price for the sake of increasing liquidity and then catching up with the share price, vis-a-vis, okay, yes, there is an overhang and people not buying because they would expect more shares to come into the market, right? I don't know the answer to this, right? It's a conundrum that we haven't thought about this. But to be honest with you, I do believe that having more shares, right? Although it may bring, some short-term pain, but I guess we're talking about weeks or months. But it would really change the trading profile of the company so much that I may be willing to offer this to the board and seek, some guidance from smart people like Mark Cora, who is the leading independent director on our board. And then they say, guys, look, it makes sense, swallow the bullet, but do this, we'll do this. But again, this is something which is not a plan, but it's one of the ideas we have, to get this issue resolved.
Okay, well, the one big question we haven't gotten to, I meant to ask it before, but I got very interested in the details of the project. But the question that I have to ask is, Russia. And maybe this is part of the liquidity issue too, and so on. You have, you have perceived Russia risk. There are Russia sanctions. My wife, who is from Minsk, she tells me he who does not risk does not drink champagne. So I understand the Russian attitude on this, but how do you convince Western investors that it's safe to do business there? And can you talk to us about the Russia risk and what your actual experience is on the ground there?
Mm-hmm. Well, to be perfectly honest with you, I think, one would be stupid to say, okay, it doesn't affect us. It does, right? And not in a positive way, in a sense that people one really has to sort of, dissect this question into a number of sort of forces. Yes, it may depress the valuations, but I was just checking, the latest valuations today for junior miners and explorers from Haywood. And to be honest with you, they are bad across the board, right? There are some good stories there, right? And actually good stories, they get valued, right? But in terms of the sort of tide, the tide is very low. The watermark is really very low, right? And therefore, in that sense, yeah, we can live with it because I believe, that yes, we have systemic risk, but on the other hand, we have a very strong story, a very solid story. And I guess, people would appreciate this. That's number one. Number two, I was looking at the Russian gold miners, the large ones like Polius or Polymetal, right? And these guys, they have no discount whatsoever compared to their peers. That's interesting. The Russian gold producers are trading at the same multiples as Yamana Gold or you name it, right? That's very interesting. So it's a matter of growing up and getting bigger and getting a very nice, exciting story. Now, thirdly, I lived long enough. Not that I lived long enough. I wish to live much, much longer. But I lived long enough, to go through the thin and thick between, in terms of attitude to Russia, right? I remember everyone didn't actually understand what was going on in Russia in the 90s. I remember, all the exuberance of 2000 to 2007 and 8, when the valuations were sky high. What I'm saying is, look, it's transitory, right? Russia is producer number 3 on the planet, producing roughly about 9% of the world's gold, right? I mean, no one can ignore Russia in terms of gold. Russia has a big gold industry, right? And therefore, if I were to have a project in Mongolia, what do? I'd wait, for Centerra Gold to come and buy me, right? If I'm living in Russia, I actually don't have to wait for Centerra Gold to come and buy me. I have Polymetal, I have Polius here, I have Petropavlovsk, I have Highland, I have plenty of very solid, very well run, very profitable listed Russian producers, right? And they share the same problem as their counterparties across the world. They need reserves. They need to replenish their reserves, right? So there is a big internal demand within Russia, right? And therefore, when there is a question who I'm going to sell it to, I mean, there is a local industry, and Chinese are coming, and I believe it's just a matter of time, before. I mean, Kinross is still there. They haven't left. They're still making a hell of a lot of money out of Russia. Probably like 40% of their free cash flow, comes out of Russia. So I think, it's trends that will come back. Now, in terms of purely business approach or, security of licenses, that kind of stuff, right? I find it easy to operate. I grew up in this country. I grew up in the USSR, but, this is my country, right? And I know how to navigate this country. It's not a bad place to be. After ruble devaluation in 2014, the costs of running the business, the costs of capital constructions, right? They are much smaller. Power is cheap, labor is cheap, electricity is cheap, everything is cheap, diesel is cheap, right? So things are cheap. That's number one. That's a good thing. Number two, I was trying to find some support in publications which can hardly be blamed for being, Russian television, RT, or Russian propaganda. I'm talking about the World Bank, and I'm talking about the Fraser Institute, right? And what's interesting that in their latest report, the ease of doing business, the World Bank puts Russia in a position 31 out of 190 countries, right? It's above France. Okay, it's not difficult to be above France. But it's above Switzerland, it's above China, it's above Mexico, it's about Brazil, it's about all these countries, South Africa, it's about all these countries that come to mind. We're talking about mining, right? It's above all of them. I mean, it's just, ahead of it are countries like Canada, some provinces, some states in the United States, but actually some states in the United States are below, much below. Think about building a mine in California these days, right? Forget about this, right? So I guess what I'm saying is that I encourage your audience to take a look at this report, or we have a page in our corporate presentation with this ranking. Russia is a very solid position, and this position is based on things like security of licenses, capital controls, ability to export profits. So all this power of contracts, believe it or not, all these wonderful things. It's not sort of perception based. It's based on sort of real things. And Fraser Institute, look, I don't really want to take too much of your time, but Fraser Institute, if you were to divide the entire ranking of the Fraser Institute into two halves, Russia would be in the better half, in the upper half, right? So that's something that's objectively confirmed, that Russia is not a bad place to be. It's cheap, right? It's above many places. Okay, I don't really want to be naming other countries, sorry. But it's much safer, than many other countries. And as long as people are talking business and they're not talking about, the political inclinations, right? Or they are not, sitting on the ration by CNN or you name it, every day, and are trying to make an independent judgment, I think it's not a bad place to be. And I guess, you see, you ask a painful question, right? Because it gets me, it points me up, because I don't experience that. I think, Russia is not a bad place to be these days. And I think, that all that nastiness or animosity, is just transitory. And I'm sorry, can we not speak about, the internal fighting between the Republicans and Democrats and what Russia, that Russia is being used as a card in the whole game, right? So let's not get into this. I think, Russia is okay. Russia is okay to be.
So that's very interesting. The big picture, but also I was curious about specifically local politics, the reality on the ground. I suppose in a place like that, the people just want to see jobs and just want to see the investment come to happen. I would imagine that on the local level, actually, the politics are very friendly.
Yeah, they are very friendly. I can think about probably China being the only other example, but I'm sure, there are more examples whereby the local governors are being evaluated in their sort of screening by the superiors, by the Kremlin, on the amount of investments attracted into their region, right? The region they run, right? So we do have a lot of support. It doesn't mean that there is no red tape. There is red tape, right? And there are processes, and some of these processes make very little sense. But yes, I guess, that there is a direct, push by the central government of Russia, by the president, by the cabinet of ministers, to see that, guys, look, we really need to make sure that we need investment. Therefore, let's see if we can create as few problems for investors as we can, and let's help them along. So, no, it's okay. It's good. It's good. I can't complain. I can't complain about things like, deforestation permits. Of course, I'd like, to be able to do deforestation in 2 weeks' time, rather than wait for 6 months to go through the process of saying which tree I'm going to cut. But again, I guess, that's the reality one has to live with.
Okay, fair enough. Well, you've been a very good sport, and you've, I think, given straight up answers to some very hard questions. So I'll give you the last word. Is there any final thought you want to leave our viewers with?
Well, first of all, thank you. I think, that we are dealing with a system which is large enough as a start and can be larger at a decent rate. We are located in a fabulous infrastructure in terms of access, power, railway, highway. That's really good. I think, that we have a very, very proven in terms of success and committed management who are playing, a very fair game. We have a crisp strategy extending for the next 2 to 3 years, whereby we want to make this company a success. And I guess, one thing that would set us apart from some of other companies, and again, I'm not saying anything bad, but, they're just still trolling for tuna. We have the tuna on the hook, right? And it feels like, it's a big and heavy tuna, right? I don't know whether it's going to be a 15 kilo tuna or 25 kilo tuna, but it's certainly not going, to be a red snapper. It feels like, it's big. Now, question is, are we smart? Can we pull it out? How long it's going us to pull out? And finally, after all, how large, this fish is going to be? But we are not trolling. We have the fish on the hook.
Okay.
I guess that's it.
I get it. So, спасибо большое. Zdelayu udachi. It's an adventure you're on there, and I wish you the best of luck.
Thanks a lot, and it was my pleasure and privilege to be talking to you. Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Cheers.